Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Blooming Daily. I remain your host, Ruth Olujobi, and I'm so excited to be back in the studio. Oh my goodness, I know that every episode is like, oh my god, I'm so excited to be back in the studio. But I really am, and I just finished my semester, the second semester of my third year at building, so
Yay.
I'm feeling very excited. And this past few weeks were very hectic, but I was very much looking forward to this, and so I am, in fact, very excited to be back in the studio and to be recording this important episode today. I mean, all our episodes are important, but I think this is very vital for this month and for every month, in fact. So I am very glad that I get to record this episode. So today we're going to speak about mental health because it's currently Mental Health Awareness Month, and I thought, yes, there's no way we're going to let this month pass without speaking about mental health. And of course, we can speak about mental health any day. We don't have to speak about mental health just on Mental Health Awareness Month. But I was like, yes, there's no way we're going to let this month of May pass without speaking about mental health. So here we are celebrating Mental Health Awareness Month and trying to speak about various topics concerning mental health. With me in the studio is an amazing person who I'm so happy to have and who has a wealth of knowledge in mental health, But I'm going to let her introduce herself. Welcome to the studio, Shelley.
Thank you. Excited to be here.
How are you doing today?
I'm doing great. I love this end of the semester, and I love the energy of people getting ready to graduate. The families are coming on campus today, and it's just a really special time to see people have completed this journey.
Yes,
Yeah.
I think it's amazing too. I have been watching my friends get ready to walk that stage, and it's just really beautiful, and I'm really happy for them because I know that class of 24, they came in when COVID was still very much a thing and raging, and people were still doing a lot of Zoom classes, and people were having to isolate themselves, and there was a lot of social distancing. So I know their first year was hard for them. So I'm very happy that they get to walk the stage and celebrate this milestone.
Yeah, this class has a special place in a lot of our hearts because, they came in with losing their graduation, losing their proms, and then they came to college kind of with almost with one hand tied behind their back. They had to meet friends, but they had to be socially distanced, and they had to have their masks, and they were in their own rooms. And that's a lot of impediments, and people did it. And then I think just the fear coming back with just the fear of contact and what that means. So this group has been through a lot. It's a group that we saw a lot of students from this class. I have a lot of people that I'm going to be cheering for on Saturday who graduated. I have a good number of seniors. They've gone through a lot. That's 4 years. Yeah.
That's so true. And so before we go into our episode, today we'll be speaking about intersectionality in mental health and understanding diverse challenges that are present within mental health. But by challenges, we don't even mean specific challenges like depression or anxiety, but challenges that are embedded in finding out if a person has mental health, or challenges that impact people and affect their mental health. And so we're going to be doing all of that. But before we go in, Shelley, I was wondering if you could please give us a bit of your background so that our audience knows. Because I'm sure some of them might be curious to know your background in counseling.
Yeah, and and how I sort of place myself. I mean, I come to this work. I worked in the legal field for a long time, and then I came to counseling later in life. And I'm an African American straight woman. I'm in my 60s now, and I certainly did not come up with any sort of experience with mental health field with with knowing anybody who was in treatment, who was in therapy. I didn't really know a lot about it at all. It was pretty much stigmatized in my family, definitely. But so I came to the work with this idea of like, does this actually make sense for me? Does this really for women of color? So my particular interest has sort of always been the mental health and wellness of people of color, our access to treatment, making sure that the treatment itself is not stigmatizing and that the treatment is equitable. And also, I'm very much a feminist, so feminist therapy, empowering my clients to kind of feel like they're making their own decisions and they have agency to kind of identify what's going on with them. So that's where it's sort of how I came into it. So I had a lot of thoughts about just sort of this very Western, very kind of white male system that I was becoming a part of. But I was able to come at a time where there's a lot of research and a lot of people doing a lot of work around multicultural counseling and talking about identity and how that impacted things. And so it felt like, okay, I can be in this space.
Yes. Yeah. Thank you for sharing that, because I think a good amount of what we'll be speaking about today has to do with identity and how socioeconomic factors and all of that impact mental health. So I'm glad that you mentioned that, because it shows that you have a breadth of experience with the things we're going to be speaking about. I wanted to make a disclaimer that we're not going to be making diagnoses on mental health. We're not going to be saying, oh, this is how to know you have depression, or this is how to know you have an anxiety disorder, or this is how to know you have, bipolar disorder. We're not going to be making all those diagnoses because we can't just make broad ones like that. There's just so much that goes into it, and so we can't make those kind of comments here, because for anyone to have a diagnosis, you need a one-on-one meeting with a healthcare provider, and so we won't be making that on the show because that's not really going to do any good.
Well, and you can get multiple diagnoses from multiple people.
Right.
So, the idea that a diagnosis is, I think one needs to be somewhat wary of diagnosis. There's, for example, African-American young men tend to get diagnosed with ADHD.
Really?
At a higher level than other people. Interesting. So I think there's sometimes, skepticism. It's a field in which being gay was actually considered a psychiatric disorder 20 years ago. So I think people should take it with some caution and not get too tied into a diagnosis that they're, been given. Women tend to get diagnosed more with things like personality disorders, like borderline personality disorder. So, there's a lot of research and there's a lot of discussion around being somewhat wary of diagnosis and not buying into it 100%.
Yeah. Thank you for mentioning that again. So we can see that diagnosis isn't something that we can just do on the episode, but we have a ton of other important things to speak about, and I'm very excited to get into these things with Shelley. So Shelley, the first thing I had on my mind when I said we're going to record this podcast was trends in the mental health discussion. Because you've been in this field for so long, I know you're someone who can look back and say, these are the trends I've seen in the mental health discussion. So I was curious to know, 20 years ago, what was the discussion on mental health like? 10 years ago, 5 years ago, how have you seen it evolve? The discussion on depression and anxiety, but even things people might not have been thinking about as much then, like maybe bipolar disorder, schizophrenia. So in your capacity, how have you seen the trends on the discussion, not even mental health itself, just even the discussion and the language?
Yeah.
How have you seen it evolve?
Yeah, I guess I'll narrow it down. I've been working in college student mental health here at Bowdoin since 29 years.
29 years. Whoa.
So when I first started, one of the things that I note now is that I think the predominant thing that people presented with was depression. We had a full-time person who did eating disorder work. One of the trends that I've noticed in eating disorder work is that 29 years ago, people were really working to kind of get rid of an eating disorder. It's become like normalized, and it's become more part of the culture in a way. So that work has changed. Definitely, it used to be, at least in my experience, and I think some of my other colleagues' experience, predominantly we were dealing with a lot of depression. The rates of anxiety have gone up enormously. Post-pandemic, the rates of social anxiety have gone up astronomically. I think the access to social media and people being able to communicate with each other around different things has changed things. Like, I remember it was fairly rare for people to be not engaged in, but to sort of talk about self-harm maybe 20 years ago. It's like pretty, it's pretty normative. It's in movies, it's in song lyrics. People, really love people who have talked really openly about their struggles and what they've done. So that's something that's not stigmatized. We used to do a lot of psychoeducation around self-harm, like cutting, probably 10, 15 years ago, explaining it's not suicidal behavior and what it was. We don't even have to do that anymore. People just kind of know, like, oh, this person cuts, that doesn't mean they're trying to hurt themselves, or so we just know it's just out in the world differently. I think stigma-wise, I think there's just, there's reality TV shows.
Yes,
there's
there is
so much out there. I think people know the DSM. I have people that I think, I'm like, you just performed the DSM, like, in order. Like, they come in and they know what all the criteria are. So that information is out there, which I think is great.
Yeah, just to clarify for those who don't know what the DSM is.
Oh, the Diagnostic Statistical Manual. That's the manual that psychiatrists use to say, okay, you have depression because you fit this criteria. You're having disruption in sleep, or you're having disruption in eating. So, yeah, I think people have access to that information. So I think there's pros and cons. I think one of the big pros is that people can say, wait a minute, I'm not alone. This is something that I'm experiencing. Other people are experiencing this. You can actually find community.
Yes.
You can find information about what you need to do.
Yes.
And then, of course, there's been the explosion in medication, where one of the significant differences I've seen since I started is that people with more serious psychiatric issues are able to stay in school because the medications have really become fairly sophisticated and allow people to kind of be more functional.
Yes.
In the beginning, there were medications that really made you pretty tired and really, impacted your focus and concentration. So if somebody had, a major bipolar situation or really serious depression, they might not have been able to really go to college, and be successful in the same way. But now with medications, it's pretty easy, and we have lots of people that come in on medications.
Yes, that is amazing. I'm so glad to hear that.
Yeah.
Thank you for sharing all of that, Shelley. That's something I was really curious about. What's the conversation around mental health like now, and how has it evolved over time? And I was curious to know your thoughts on how the pandemic impacted the conversation around mental health. How did you think the pandemic aggravated things? How did you think it exposed maybe lapses in the mental health care system? How do you think it's maybe worsened things, worsened the conversation? Because we can say technology only improved the conversation on mental health. I also think technology might have also done some harm to the conversation around mental health, So how do you think the pandemic played a role in all of this?
It's interesting. There was just a online conversation with college health professionals talking about this very subject, and part of it was the sort of reaction to the pandemic, this sort of kind of crisis language and sort of mode of action that's been out there, and whether or not that's actually not really helpful. Maybe it's more hurtful than helpful. I think post-pandemic, we did have people were isolated.
That's very true.
They were very isolated and they were scared. And so definitely saw this rise in anxiety, which makes sense.
Yeah.
And, and then I think there has been a business of sort of marketing that, there's a lot of companies that have now come up who are like, we're going to, kind of try to help you with your anxiety and fear.
That's so true.
And so, I think it's interesting because I think there's some people who've been working in the field, like this man, James Gordon, who's a doctor who works out of D.C., and he's been doing a lot of work with trauma for years, working at refugee camps and working with people who've been dealing with severe trauma related to war and to famines. And he talks about kind of a global response to these things, this sort of not a normalization, but a global response to their suffering, that we all kind of suffer in different ways, but there's ways that we can heal. I think that there can be a little bit of a tendency to kind of want it to be more individualized.
Yes.
And to not kind of access people's innate strengths and abilities to kind of overcome a lot of things. So anxiety has become, in some mental health things, has become a little bit of a fast food kind of thing in some ways.
Yes.
In some ways it's complicated. In some ways maybe it's simple. When we think about sort of wellness and the things that people need to be well, to be physically well, to be emotionally well, a lot of it, the first thing is usually connection.
Yes.
That we need connection with each other, that we need connection with nature, that we need movement. It's really simple things that we need. And I think there are people who are concerned that in the absence of creating that, are we medicating things that could maybe be healed by slowing down, being more intentional, having more mindfulness, having less of a resting.
I think that's really interesting. I'm going to pick something you said there. You said there's a tendency for us to medicate things that can be healed without pills, know.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's very interesting, when you're given, let's say, what could I think? Let's say an anxiety drug, when the root cause is maybe the person being under a lot of family pressure and having a lot of family distress, and just that was a very blank statement, but
yeah,
just saying, when sometimes the issue is not medical, and so the pills only provide temporary solutions, which is really sad, because the thing with all these pills is that our brains become dependent on them, and the chemicals that they release when they get into our synapses and all of that. And so we might have a person becoming dependent on a drug they weren't even maybe supposed to start taking in the first place, and then it aggravates their issue. And so I thought that was something very interesting.
I don't necessarily worry it's going to aggravate an issue. I mean, I've seen people who've had some pretty tremendous recovery with medication. I think that it needs to be in combination with other things. There's definitely, chemical deficiencies that happen that can be really fixed. I mean, people have more biological depressions.
Yes,
more
very true.
Things. So medication can be really super helpful.
It can.
Sometimes I find, people, if you're not able to sort of access doing therapy or being able, if you can't get out of bed, you can't go for a walk, right?
Exactly.
So a lot of times medication is really a good way to get somebody up into a place where they can be more functional. So I think to that extent, it's super helpful. And I've seen people really bloom, as you, but having medication. So I'm not really anti-medication, but I am also, and this is probably because I work in college mental health, also aware that we're in a system where this, I always ask, how much is the system responsible and how much can we shift things in the system so that someone who feels like it's okay to say, I need rest, like I actually can't get this paper in because I'm really tired, and that's okay. Where do we have it built in that people can kind of have balance? Without having to create a mental health crisis for themselves, right?
What you said reminds me of an episode I had last year on stress. Mm-hmm. And Shelley and I spoke about the pressures that we feel internally, the pressures that we put on ourselves, and the pressures that other people put on us. And we're not even speaking about bad pressure necessarily. Like getting in a paper is not a bad pressure. Studying for your exam is not a bad pressure necessarily. Mm-hmm. But then how those things impact our health and how sometimes many times our stressors are beyond us. There are things we can't really control because you really have to study for that exam. I mean, you can control to an extent. Maybe you can start studying several weeks before. But even students that study several weeks before, I know some students still feel a lot of stress the week of the exam. So some of our stressors aren't really up to us to remove. They will happen whether or not we like it. So I think it's really interesting that you mentioned the word called structures and systems, because I think a lot of the issues we have, and like would mention later on in this episode, are very systematic. Socioeconomic status, race, and the effect on mental health. I think a number of these things are very systematic. They're so embedded with our systems that we can barely even see them. So that is very true.
Yeah. And I think one of the other trends that I'm realizing, that we've seen is this sort of trend towards perfectionism that I think maybe when I started, perfectionism was something that someone saw as like an impediment, and then now I think it's more like, oh, I'm a perfectionist. It's seen as kind of a positive thing, and I do think that's a reaction to fear and anxiety, economic fear and anxiety, that it's no longer enough to just get a degree. You have to have a degree with with grades and things, and so people, I think, are very, very much trying to do everything perfectly. And that's created enormous amount of stress, and that's become kind of normalized. To say that you're a perfectionist is kind of, I don't know, that's just...
Yeah, say I'm a perfectionist at work or school or, all of that. Yes, I think it is, like you said, more normalized now, and maybe something that's celebrated, like,
yeah. And I think the social media that creates this kind of illusion. When I was in college in the 70s, and it was, back then you were like, you were either a good student, maybe you were a good athlete, maybe you were like, a supermodel. You weren't expected to be all of those things. Maybe one of those things, but not all of them. But now I think there's this pressure to be like, to look a certain way, to get really good grades, to be all these things. And you can create a narrative, an identity, and you can put it out there, and then you get feedback and see how people respond.
Yes, that's what social media does.
Yeah. And so you're like, oh, that works. That doesn't work. You also, and I talk about this a lot with my clients, you have this, there's the social comparison now. When I was in high school, if I wanted to see my friends, we would have to physically be in the same place to see each other, right? We were not the cool kids. I was a nerd in high school, and we were nerds, and we kind of knew it, but we weren't able to kind of peep on other people's lives and go, oh, wow, look how cool they are. Look what they're doing. So we were just in our own little nerd world doing our thing. And I think about how it would be so different if we were able to look into other people. We wouldn't have been together. We would have been in our own separate houses, looking at what everybody else was doing, comparing ourselves to those people. We wouldn't have been fully in our own experience. And And I do feel really sad for that, for people, because I think that social comparison is really dangerous.
It is.
And it's a place where people are kind of often pretending, where they're not maybe sometimes being honest about how they're not okay.
Yes.
It's this whole, projection of look at all these things. And that's problematic. And I think too much time that we're able to spend looking in on other people's lives who were not even people in our inner circles. I mean, I think of even my own Facebook, where I have people who I'm like, I know what they're doing because I get Facebook posts and things, but I don't have their home phone number or address. Really, I don't send them a Christmas card. That's kind of weird, right? Mm-hmm. So we have this incredible information with people that are in our secondary circles, and that's unprecedented. That's not something that people had access to before.
Thank you for sharing all of that. And again, circling back to the question of the pandemic, I think the pandemic again really blew things up in terms of social media. People were, I think even for the younger people, the people who are currently teenagers, maybe from the age of 15 right now, then they were 11, but just really thinking about how they were at home and then being exposed to social media and doing that a lot. You see a lot of young people on social media these days, and so I really think the pandemic had a huge impact, and so I can only imagine what the impact was like on people's mental health. And now I had a question on some of the challenges that comes with mental health, and by this I mean some of the challenges in terms of things people can't control, like race or socioeconomic status or environment. And I wanted to hear from you how you think all this social construct or all this placements in society impact people's mental health and makes it easier or more difficult to access mental health care or to even talk about mental health or to feel like they're worthy of being treated for mental health, if I would say. So I wanted to hear, we can take it together, we can take it one after the other, but race, socioeconomic status, how do you think that impacts? And earlier in the episode, you mentioned that, diagnosis.
Well, I guess starting with race, I think you think about historically providers. Right now, I think less than 5% of psychologists in the United States are people of color. So you're talking again about a medical system where people being treated by people who don't look like them, a medical system that may be based on principles and things that experiments, perceptions that are about people that are not them.
Yes.
And so I think there's a book that we were reading for our office, for the counseling office, and for the health center called Killing the Black Body. And it's a book about just sort of the history of kind of experimentation and things that have been done to the black body by the medical establishment. So there's some really good reasons why people are reluctant to engage in treatment. That is very true. Right? So I think there's that, does this actually make sense for me? Is this a safe place for me to sort of to be in? So that, I think race stuff is just huge. And then, the social economic in terms of access. It's a huge issue right now with insurance, who is able to sort of get treatment, who's not able to get treatment, what sort of treatment are you actually able to get? There's certainly places, we're finding with the fentanyl epidemic that there are places where people have been over-medicated.
Yes, a friend sent me a screenshot of that.
Yeah,
yes.
Right? So medication has been used as a weapon to silence, people in some ways. Things have been spread within certain communities. And so there's, I think, I think reasonable skepticism. And then I think, all of those things make people, I think, hesitant to sort of then go in and to sort of trust. And and in some ways, treatments have not necessarily been, culturally sensitive.
That's true.
A lot of sort of traditional psychology is sort of based on somebody having power who listens to, interprets. And, when you're not empowering the person to tell you their story, you don't presume that they have really the answers to heal themselves. I mean, people have been healing themselves for centuries, right? Mm-hmm. So I think people have really good inherent wisdom. So, so it's complicated.
It is complicated.
It's definitely complicated. And I think what I see in college mental health with students of color coming here is people kind of becoming part of this community, noticing the kind of services and things that some people have had access to their entire lives that they have not had access to, wondering if those things have actually given people an advantage in terms of their academics and in terms of other things. So that is, really interesting. There's tons of research around the idea that people have all kinds of, childhood traumas. They have things that happen, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they are not going to be successful.
Yes.
That those things happen and they can, get through them. So, and in positive psychology, this idea that there are fixed factors that we can't control, but that there are a lot of other factors, probably maybe 30, 40% that we can control. And so we should. But I think for students, especially here, I think it's that intersection of kind of going whoa, this is interesting.
It is interesting.
That this person has had access to medical care, dental care, all kinds of things.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, that is interesting, and not in the fascinating way, but in the way that makes me think more and makes me want to probe more into all of these issues. And that leads to the next question I had about specific mental health issues that you think personally from your place as a counselor, specific mental health issues you think marginalized communities face. And by that, I don't even mean even in the US, I mean all over the world. I think, what are the mental health issues you think low-income communities or marginalized communities are prone to facing, and why you think that is the case? Because we have listeners from all over the world, and if you say, oh, I think, from my experience over the years with mental health, I think these kind of communities are prone to facing this mental health issue, because this is what kind of issues come to your mind first. And you might not have many, but I'm curious to know, especially from a professional standpoint, what do you think are some mental health issues marginalized communities are more likely to face, and why do you think that is the case? What makes them more prone than other wealthier communities?
Well, one of the things that comes to mind, and it's because it's my interest as an African-American woman myself, but African-American women have one of the highest rates of suicide of any group, right?
Wow.
Lots of, high rates of depression, but the suicide rate is high because people often don't get treatment, and by the time they get treatment, they are pretty much at a severe point. And so that relates to race and to gender things, the pressures of enduring racism and sexism.
Yeah.
This then not accessing treatment, the sort of superwoman syndrome where you're supposed to be strong all the time.
I was going to ask you about that because someone mentioned that to me yesterday.
Have to be strong. And then you hear these stories of people who then there's this extreme. I mean, I lose sleep at night about those statistics. They're very, very high. There was just a really recent, well-publicized situation where a woman who was a vice president of student affairs at a college had shared with her her boss, who was the president of the college, that she was dealing with mental health issues and had asked for time off, didn't get the time off, and ended up committing suicide and wrote a letter that became very public and things. But it resonated for so many people because there are a lot of people who can relate to that happening. And that's kind of what you hear. You don't hear, oh, this person was depressed. You just hear, oh, this person killed themselves. The woman who was the Miss USA, woman who was like the first Black woman to be Miss USA, was dealing with a ton of depression. Nobody knew it until they reported her suicide.
Oh, no.
So I think that's that kind of, I have to be okay, when in fact it's exhausting to be dealing with these things all the time. And it's the macro aggressions and it's the micro. I was, it's kind of a diversion, but it's sort of an example of what I consider kind of a, I don't know, microaggression. But the other day I was stopped in Brunswick somewhere, and a truck in front of me rolled into me, kind of hit me a little bit.
Oh my goodness.
It wasn't a big deal. It's like a bump. And so I didn't think anything about it. I just backed up and I didn't think anything about it because my car's fine. I get to work and I realize this person has followed me to the building parking lot, right? I get out of my car and this man, who happens to be white, and says, "What the F? Why did you hit my car?" And I said, "I didn't hit your car." And I said, "You bumped into me and I didn't hit your car." And then he starts to then call me an effing B, yelling. And I'm thinking in that moment, this is about a way more than that, right?
Yes.
I was like, I'm not going to get engaged with this guy because it's kind of scary. And he's clearly got other stuff going on.
Yes.
And I also realized that when he probably saw me driving into the Bowdoin lot, it probably pissed him off even more.
Yes.
So I was like
she works here?
She works, yeah. Like I knew, I knew. And I had to go to a staff meeting. I went to a staff meeting and everybody's like, oh, and I said, this just happened. And my staff was like, oh my God. Like they were just, did you call security? But when I told my friends who are African American, they're like, oh yeah, I had a friend,
Wow.
They were like, yeah, like they totally got it. My staff was, they were great, but they were surprised. And I'm like, this is what it is. Like, I'm not really that surprised. That's the kind of thing where I got a reaction that had nothing to do with that. Like that man was, he was
just angry at you.
He was angry at me. I said, and my other, I don't know if there was a white woman, would he have called her an effing B like that quickly and that vehemently?
Wow.
Probably not. And again, you got it. Like, that sometimes, when he saw that I was on this campus, and I'm sure it did not. No.
Like, what, you mean she works here?
Yeah.
Like,
yeah.
Wow.
Right?
Wow.
And so that's the kind of thing, right, that we deal with all the time. Mm-hmm. Where I tell my friends where they're like, yeah, I've gotten flipped off when I'm driving my car, if I'm in a nice car and I'm on, by people. So there's like these ways that you feel like you're in a hostile environment. So that thing, being able to have a space to talk about that, I worry about that thing. Black mothers who have sons who, it's scary if you've got a son and they're out driving around or they're doing anything, right? Yes. Now it's like they're in their apartment and they open their door.
Yes,
right?
yes, really.
So, so that's the kind of thing where, like, is there a pill for that? Like, what, I think it's that kind of stress. So one of the wellness activities that I'm really excited about that has been happening. I don't know if you've heard of Girl Trek.
I think I have.
So these two women who looked at all these stats and were worried, started this organization where they have Black women walking half an hour every day because they know that is actually really effective for dealing with depression. they have people in groups, and they have a podcast, and they have people listening to stories of Black women. So they started it with sort of these Black history podcasts. So you would walk for half an hour and you'd hear about like the Montgomery bus boycott or something. Wow. And now they have all these different subjects, and they have groups. I want to start one in September here. But they have all these groups. But that was like this, and it's about creating community for Black women to break the isolation, and also the really key fact that we know that a half an hour of exercise is equivalent to taking a low dose of an antidepressant in terms of wellness. So to me, like, such a brilliant way of looking at what's going on. And they teach history, they teach empowerment, they teach so many good things. And they're also doing it through this, like, let's get moving together, which, is helping. So
that sounds amazing.
It's really amazing. Girl Trek. I'm all about it. They're amazing.
There's this organization I know of. I can't remember what they're called, but I got to know of them through Instagram, and they do this like skipping rope, this jump rope, and I can't remember what they're called, but they have Black women and I think men doing jump rope in different states, and they travel around the states, and you see people so happy, and so I can only imagine what that does to a person's mental health when
it's accessible, like you just have a rope, right?
Exactly.
And I think about my mom growing up in the 30s and 40s. That's what they did. They skipped rope. They were outside all the time skipping rope and doing things, and they were sort of in community with each other.
Yes.
So I love these things that are happening to kind of address these issues that are going on.
Yes.
Is, getting women outside and walking. Girl Trek is pretty amazing.
I'm glad to hear that. And I feel like even for people who don't have Girl Trek chapters in there, I don't know of any Girl Trek chapters around me. I think people can even just walk, just like you said. It's such a powerful thing, but we're still going to get into that. But before we move on to that, I wanted to probe more on how our environment impacts our mental health. If how you think our immediate environment, and by environment I mean it can be family, those you surround yourself with. It can also be your work community. It can be your, whether you're living in Nigeria versus you're living in Germany or you're living in the UK.
Yeah.
I want to hear your perspective on how our environment impacts our mental health. How do you think that the people we surround ourselves with, the things we surround ourselves with, impact our mental health, and why would one person be more prone to an issue than another person?
I think that's a great observation. I think that there is like 100% correlation between your environment and how you are. I think if you're in a affirming, validating environment, it helps you grow. I think that there's a tendency, like with families, for people to feel like they have to resolve things within family systems, but sometimes the family system is toxic, and when there's something toxic, you need to get away, right? You don't, I call it like get out of the burning house. You don't have to figure out where the source of the fire is. You just need to get out of the burning house, right? So I do think we need to think about, does this environment, we talk about like, does this object bring me joy? Does this person, does this environment bring me joy? Am I predominantly feeling joy, or am I feeling stress, or what am I feeling? Because that energy is important. We grow, I look at blooming. I saw this really great cartoon, and it had a bunch of different plants, and one had anxiety on it, was written anxiety, one was like regret, one was anger, and then the other one was love. And they were like, the one that blooms is the one that you water, right? And so I just love that image of like, we have a tendency to sometimes overwater some of these things.
Yes.
But what we sort of put our energy into is the thing that blooms and is the thing that grows. And so it makes sense that if we're in an environment that is healthy ground, that we are going to bloom. And if we're not, it's okay to sort of step back and say, this is maybe not a healthy space for me to be in, or to find your own, space, because it can change so much. I mean, as somebody traveled, I know the first time that I went to West Africa, I was in Ghana, and it was really funny. For like the 10 days that I was there, I joke with my friends, I was kind of like a supermodel when I was there. It was like the friends that I was with were not, I had dreadlocks at the time. I had these like blonde dreadlocks, which was like a really big deal. Then it was like cool. But it was really interesting to see how differently you get perceived in a different environment and how that makes you feel.
Yes.
And my friends who had got more traditional, attention somewhere else were like, what is, they still joke about it. They're like, remember when Shelley was a supermodel? Because I'm not a supermodel any other time. But it was funny. I was like, it's environment, and so we do have to pick environments that are healthy. I think people, what I've seen for students here coming into this environment, for a lot of people, it's the first time they've been in an environment where it's as white as it is at Bowdoin, and it can be shocking, and just you don't see yourself reflected in the environment. That has changed enormously in the almost 30 years I've been here.
Yes.
I used to be able to, I knew every student of color pretty much by name. It was pretty easy to know who everybody was. Like, now there's people, they're juniors, I've never met them before. There's sub-communities where there's actually an African Alliance because there's enough students to do that.
Yes.
There's different groups within LASO. There's like the Mexican students in LASO, the Puerto Rican students in LASO, the Dominican. That was not a thing. So that is really wonderful, because I think what has been nice is that students really had a hard time in the beginning. My first 3 years here, it was difficult to navigate this place, and people were very alone, and they were very dependent on a lot of the faculty and staff for support. Now people are communities of their own support, which has really been nice to see.
That's nice.
Black Girl Brunch. The first time that happened, I was like, what? So cool.
And you mentioned something about picking an environment that is, nourishing for us. But I wanted to ask, what if you can't do that? What if it's just the community you live in? What if you can't just wake up and leave? What do you do? What if that's the place you've always grown up? What if it's the issue is not with, let's say, your family or your workplace. The issue is with your government. How do you still navigate mental health in those times where it's as though your government is against you, or the structures and the policies? And
I get your neighborhood's not safe.
So how do you navigate that?
I think that becomes kind of like that internal space, right? I think that's when I think faith comes in, where I think people have to have that space within themselves, that they have to create a safe space within themselves with their higher power, with something to kind of make sense of it. Because a lot of times our physical spaces are not safe, or communities aren't safe, our leaders are not safe, you can't be, so that's, I think, that internal part, and that's this sort of reading and getting sustenance from other people who've been in that situation. Whenever I'm doing something that's a little different and challenging, I have this bracelet I have on today that I got from somebody from South Africa. And I think of Mandela, Sal, when things were difficult. How did he survive? How do people survive? And then, I read about those people, I think about them, I pray about them, pray for them, and say, there's those times where it's tough. He was in that cell for a long time. Yes. And there are people that are still in cells of sorts, right? That are stuck. And, it's like,
it's hard.
Yeah, it's hard. And, sending grace and sending love to other people. My spiritual practice is generally a Buddhist practice. And so one of the things that I try to do every day is a metta practice where I send loving kindness to people. who I know are suffering, who I know, are not happy, healthy, safe, and wish those things for them. And also know that, there's a lot of suffering that we actually have absolutely no control over.
I definitely understand that. And I definitely, what you said about faith, I think is something that is a very big thing for me as someone who's a Christian. And I remember this semester I had times where I was very, very anxious because of schoolwork. If you like, for those who were close to me during those moments this semester, knew like how stressed I got at certain points during the semester, certain like major points of like exams and big deadlines. And faith was definitely a big thing, not even at those points, but throughout the semester. And it has always been, but just being able to pray about these things and being able to pray about my stress, because like I said, sometimes even, thinking of bolding, I can't really remove myself from the stress, I'm in it. I have to go through it. Yeah. And so faith was a big thing. And then even back at home in Nigeria, thinking about the just like I said, like, if it's the government or if it's policies that are just that seem as if they're built against you, I think faith is another big thing. Just praying and believing and hoping, because many of these things are, like, again, you can't prescribe a pill for like dealing with your government. How do you do that?
Well, and there's research that shows that high levels of spirituality equal lower levels of anxiety and depression. There's definitely a correlation between people who have serious faith-based practices and an improvement in mental health. So there's definitely a correlation. What were some of the things, scriptures or things that were helpful for you when you thought about with anxiety?
For me, I think a big scripture that was on my mind was, don't be anxious for anything, but in everything by prayer and supplication make your request known to God. That was a very big one for me. Yeah. Or the scripture that says, if God can clothe the lilies of the valleys and the plants, how much more will he clothe you? And that was a scripture about being anxious for tomorrow. It's like, and there's a scripture that says, therefore don't be anxious for tomorrow. For tomorrow has enough worries of its own. Instead, focus on this. So I think those scriptures were really grounding, because, when I was in the midst of high stress situations, I remember one particular night where I think this was the first time I actually noticed that I was having like an anxiety attack, because my chest was so tight. Yeah. I was like almost heaving. I was trying to do my assignment. I was sitting in one of the classroom buildings. I was trying to do my assignment, but I just couldn't continue. My chest was so tight. And then I texted a friend, and after explaining how I was feeling, she was like, Ruth, I think you might be having an anxiety attack. And I was like, wait, what? And then I Googled, even though, don't trust Dr. Google, guys. Yeah. Then I Googled, and I just had a feeling that might have been it, because it was just because exactly I knew that I was, because of the situation I was under. I knew that it was a high possibility that was it, because I was so stressed. I think I had an exam coming up. I had so many deadlines, and so I remember reciting like Bible verses to myself and reminding myself that things will be okay, and that, I might be under the stressful situation, but it's going to be fine, praying over it. And so, yes, I think that I really like how you mentioned faith. There's this person I follow online, this young person who does mental health, and she speaks a lot about how her faith helps with her mental health, because she has a few mental health issues that she's been diagnosed with, actually, like medically. And she keeps speaking about how, like, many times where she has bipolar disorder episodes, many times it's her faith that helps her get back on track. And so I definitely agree. And I think, it's so complex. And I'm not even saying that, this, like, me reading the scripture automatically made took things away. No, the next day I still woke up feeling a bit anxious because I was still in the midst of the stressors. I still had to write that exam, I still had to meet those multiple deadlines. I still had to show up to spaces and do certain things. So that's why I was curious to hear about how you think people can navigate these situations when they can't really pull themselves out. Let's say it's a toxic friend group. Okay, you can pull yourself out. But what if it's just school that is being a big stress? Or what if you attend a school that doesn't really support you, but you don't?
You work somewhere and you have a really abusive boss.
So, there's sometimes you can pull yourself out, but there's sometimes it's just harder to pull yourself out because there's nothing to...
Yeah.
It's not
a lot
as
of time
easy.
It's faith in your relationship with God, right? To sort of say, I don't have control of this situation. Trust that somebody is looking over you isn't going to give you more than you can handle. And in that situation also, with the panic, I call it leaving the scene of the crime. Like if you're starting to feel panic, to sort of get up and move around, because our brain kind of thinks that we're getting ready to get attacked by a bear, right? It's getting us ready for an attack. So if an animal is coming to attack you, you would freeze, right?
Yes.
So your brain is like, okay, she's freezing. It's getting everything ready so you don't bleed out. It it starts to scrap your memory so that if you wake up after your attack, you don't go into shock, which is great if you're getting attacked or you're in a car accident and you wake up and not great if you've been studying all night for an exam and all of a sudden you can't remember anything, right?
Yes.
So if you can get up and walk around, you're signaling to your brain that actually you're not under attack. Because an animal that's getting ready to get attacked by a bear doesn't walk around, right?
Yes.
So you want to kind of walk around, and then you want to do some like loud breathing, like really try to deep breathe, because an animal also doesn't breathe loudly when, in fact, it's getting attacked. It gets really quiet, and the breathing is actually going to regulate your central nervous system if you're able to kind of take a deep breath, you breathe in for like a 4 count, hold it for 4, and then breathe out for like 6. That will send some signals to your brain that you don't need, because your brain is getting, it's getting your body ready.
Yes.
And you want to send it a different message.
Yes.
But I think the spiritual part is, okay, this too shall pass, right? Like it's, a lot of stress is normal. Like,
yes.
Once it gets to a certain point, it's not productive. Like it's productive and it gets us moving. But then if it gets too high,
that is
productivity
so true. That
goes
curve
down.
is so true.
Yeah. So you don't want it to go away. You just want it to be kind of like, and one of the ways that makes it maybe not go up so high is to say, okay, right now this is this, but this is not going to be this way next week. It's not going to be this way in a month. It's just right now in this moment, I have 2 things due. And I'm stressed, and maybe can I take a break? Should I go for a walk, or should I call somebody, or, what should I do to sort of break this up?
And I like what you said now about us not wanting the stress to go away necessarily, because I had a conversation with someone, I think on Monday, when I was telling him that, I had, many moments of stress this semester, but it's inevitable that I will feel stressed. You can't remove stress from life, You
just want it to be reasonable. I mean, a certain amount of stress is normal. It's fine. But you want it to be within reasonable limits so that you can use it for good and not for evil, right?
That is true. Because, if we had a stress-free life, then it wouldn't, how do you have a stress-free life, So,
you don't. No.
So, I'm glad you mentioned that. And what you said about breathing and all of that leads nicely to the last section of this episode, which is how we can take care of our mental health and look out for others. I want to turn this over to you because you're a professional in this field. And if you had some major tips you want to share to people on how they can take care of themselves, how they can take care of others, especially in terms of mental health, what would that be? And if you have some tips that are more specific to certain groups, like, okay, if you are in a place like this where it's harder to pull yourself out, or if you're in a place like this, if you have specific tips, that would be amazing. But even if you don't have specific ones, because different things work for different people, what tips would you have?
I mean, I think in some ways they're pretty simple, right? it's kind of like the things that you learned in kindergarten. I think for most people in terms of mental health, my first thing that I would say over and over again is movement, exercise, that we need to kind of move our bodies. It helps reduce stress. It helps with our mood, that we want to sort of move in ways that make sense. And it could be going for a walk. Ideally, going for a walk with somebody would be perfect. It could be dancing. It could be doing any sort of movement, but movement is really important. I think food and nutrition is super important. Fruits, vegetables, really being mindful of sugar and caffeine and alcohol. But I think it really does make a difference. I think having time for sort of prayer and reflection is really important. I know, a really important part of my day is I like the Calm app, and I listen to their morning meditation every single morning, and then I do a longer meditation usually after that. I think having a spiritual practice where you're just being sort of mindful and setting an intention for the day or building a relationship with a higher power on a daily basis is really important. Having connection with people, not being isolated, being with people. There's so many studies. There's so many things. The Blue Zone studies where they look at elderly people who live to be 100. Most of those people live in communities where the elders are getting together all the time. They'll get together and they watch the younger children, but a lot of what you see is community and people being together. That idea that if you're holding a burden that, and I know this is what happens when people are in places where there's oppressive government things going on. It's being with other people who are experiencing the same thing in a safe way that keeps people going, right? That you can be with people and you can complain, and maybe it's going to be people knitting together, or maybe people quilting together, or going for a walk together, or getting water together, or whatever they're doing. But that community thing, not being isolated, I think is really super important. I think creative expression. A lot of people are doing work. I think one of the things that's been shown to be most transformative with survivors of trauma has been using creative expression. This idea that you're going to sort of overcome a trauma doesn't really make sense because you just have to learn to live with it. But I think that people often create really beautiful art, write really wonderful things. I think finding a way to kind of, and it gives you some control. It's like you now have control over a narrative, and you can create a narrative that you want, the way that you want things to look. So I think some of those like really simple things, I think that people can do. I think supporting other people, trying to listen without judgment, trying not to sort of fix another person, but just bearing witness with them and being honest if you can't, because sometimes they may be talking about something that's really triggering, and so you really can't. So you might have to find somebody else to do that for you. But just listening and bearing witness and just being able to say, I'm really sorry for what you went through. I'm really sorry that you experienced that. And that's okay. I'm really sorry for your loss. We can't replace people that have been lost. They're gone. But we can say, I'm really sorry for your loss. And we can be willing to sit there with somebody while they cry or when they talk about it. So I think bearing witness with other people, is really super important. And again, I think, with the movement, getting outside, I think nature has a lot to teach us around change, that things are not always going to be the same. The weather today is not going to be the weather tomorrow. But that it's, a fire can happen and then something regrows, right?
Yes.
So I think finding some way to get grounded in nature. And then I guess the last thing I would say would be gratitude work, intentionally keeping track of things that you're grateful for. We tend to have a negativity bias built in our brain, so we can remember, you'll probably remember the one negative thing a professor said, but you don't remember the positives. So we have to retrain our brains to kind of track positive emotion and positive experience. And so writing down 3 things every day, every night that you're grateful for is a really great practice that actually has been shown to reduce anxiety and depression. And one of the things people find is the things they're grateful for are pretty simple. It could be, an ice cold Diet Coke. It could be just like watching a squirrel go up the tree. It could be anything. But it trains us to kind of really focus on positive experience, because I think that we can be hard on ourselves.
Yes.
And some people will spend the end of the day thinking about what could I have done better.
That's true.
And so I think that. And I guess the last thing I'll say, I'm a big proponent of self-compassion practice. It's simple, but it's the idea of treating yourself in the way that you would treat a best friend or a beloved person. We often speak to ourselves and about ourselves in ways that are harsh. And so I think to be able to just ask yourself, okay, if your friend got a B on this exam, would you be like, oh my God, you should have studied more. I can't believe you're at Bowdoin. You're never going to med school. You're never going to do this. You wouldn't say that to them, right? Because it's A, not true, and B, it's not very reinforcing. But we say those things to ourselves. Like, we can be really hard on ourselves. So I think practicing, like, what was it like to actually be compassionate to yourself? Because particularly in a moment of suffering, when you're suffering, isn't that when you should be kind to yourself, right?
That's so true.
So I think, that self-compassion I've been doing a lot of that work with people, and it feels really simple but powerful to think about, like, how can we be kind to ourselves? Mm-hmm. Our thoughts, how can we sort of take care of ourselves in the ways that we take care of other people? Because I find, like, especially here at Bowdoin, people are amazing in taking care of their friends. And when I say, oh, what would you do in this situation for this friend? They say, oh, I would do this. I'm going to take them to Gelato Fiasco. I'm going to do this and that. I'm like, and they really see, if I say, oh, well, what did you say to that friend when they got, and they're like, oh, but they're so good at this and they're so good at that. And they totally get it. And I'm like, and if that was you? And it's like, we just want those 2 things to just get a little bit closer, right? To just kind of like not have such a disparity between the ways that we talk about ourselves and think about ourselves and other people.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So
that was amazing. Thank you so much for sharing. Yeah. You said so many important things, and I think the things that you mentioned cut across so many aspects of mental health and so many groups of people, which is something I'm really happy about, because like we said at the beginning of this episode, it's so complex, it's so broad. We could have several episodes on just mental health, but we wanted to touch on a few things you might not be thinking about necessarily, like how your environment impacts your mental health, or how race and gender and socioeconomic status and the issue with providing maybe diagnosis, or the pros and cons of pills and all of that, things you might not really think about. So that's what we wanted to touch on, and I think Shelley did an amazing job in speaking about this. So thank you so much, Shelley, and thank you to everyone for listening.
Thank you for inviting me.
We have come to the end of this episode. Thank you for joining us on our special episode to celebrate Mental Health Awareness Month. We hope that you can keep speaking about mental health awareness, and you can keep having this nuanced conversation on mental health, advocacy, treatment, and all of that, because mental health is a crucial part of our overall health and wellness. Please share with people you know would find this impactful, and don't forget to leave us a comment on any of our social media pages, whether it's on LinkedIn or Facebook or Instagram, wherever. We're on so many platforms. So please leave us a comment or your questions, and you can even directly respond on some of the podcasting platforms like Spotify or YouTube. So please leave your comment, because we really want to hear them. And we will catch you on the next episode. Thank you again for joining me, Shelley.
Thank you.
And we hope that you all stay well and enjoy the rest of the month. Bye.